The wagon wheels had stopped turning 3 days past. When the last of the oxen collapsed beneath the merciless sun, Margaret Sullivan stood at the edge of the dusty trail, her weathered boots planted firm against the red earth, watching the horizon swallow the last merchant caravan heading west. They'd offered her passage for a price she couldn't pay, and she'd waved them on with what dignity remained to a widow of 23 summers. The wind caught her dark hair, pulling strands loose from the severe bun she'd fashioned that morning with trembling fingers. Everything about her spoke of haste, the hastily mended tear in her brown calico dress, the way her shawl hung crooked across thin shoulders, the single carpet bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. Inside that bag lay all that remained of Elizabeth Margaret Sullivan, a tarnished silver locket with her mother's portrait, her father's pocket watch that no longer kept time, and the deed to a homestead she'd never see again. Behind her, the town of Redemption Creek grew smaller with each step, its church spire a dark finger pointing accusingly at the cloudless sky. She didn't look back. Couldn't. The bruises hidden beneath her high collar had faded to yellow-green, but the words still echoed fresh as morning. No decent woman leaves her husband's grave unmarked. You bring shame on his memory. Margaret Sullivan. But Thomas Sullivan deserved no marker, no memory preserved in stone. Let the earth take him unnamed, she thought, her jaw set hard as granite. Let him rot forgotten, as he'd left her heart to rot through 3 years of marriage that felt like 30. The vastness of the territory stretched before her, an ocean of sage and buffalo grass rippling gold beneath the October sun. Mountains rose like broken teeth on the horizon, purple-blue in the distance, promising both shelter and peril. She'd heard tales in town, whispered over wash basins and quilting frames, Apache raids, bandits, wolves, and worse. But what waited in the wilderness couldn't be worse than what she'd left behind in that proper Christian town with its proper Christian folk who'd seen her blackened eye and called it wifely duty. Her stomach gnawed at itself, empty since yesterday's crust of bread, the last of her provisions. The general store owner had made his position clear when she'd asked for credit. Widows got no business traveling alone. Mrs. Sullivan. Best you find yourself another husband quick-like, for winter sets in proper. Another husband, as if she'd trade one cage for another, as if she'd forgotten the weight of Thomas's fists, the bourbon-sour breath, the way he'd sold her mother's china to pay gambling debts, and then blamed her for his losses. No, she'd rather face the wolves. The sun climbed higher, a brass coin in the endless blue. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, making the wool dress itch fierce. She'd walked maybe 10 miles since dawn, following the rutted trail that wound westward toward Fort Defiance, though she had no intention of stopping there. Too many soldiers, too many men who looked at a woman alone and saw opportunity. Her plan, such as it was, lived more in hope than reason, somewhere beyond the fort. Her mother's cousin had settled with his wife, or so claimed a letter from 2 years past. They'd offered shelter if she ever needed it, back when Thomas still lived and such offers seemed like mere politeness. Now that scrawled address, tucked safe in her bodice, represented her only chance at a new beginning. A lizard skittered across the path, disappearing into the shade of a twisted mesquite. Margaret paused, hand shading her eyes, searching for water. The last stream had been hours ago, and her throat burned dry as kindling. In the distance, a line of cottonwoods suggested moisture, but distance in this country proved treacherous. What looked like an hour's walk might take 3. She shifted the carpetbag to her other hand, feeling the weight of decision in every step. Each footfall took her further from the world she'd known: church socials and ladies' auxiliaries, proper gloves for calling, the right way to pour tea. Out here, such niceties meant nothing. Out here, she was no longer Mrs. Thomas Sullivan, the banker's disappointing wife who couldn't produce an heir. She was just Margaret Maggie. Her father used to call her alone under the vast dome of sky. The memories rose unbidden as she walked. Thomas's funeral, barely attended. The few mourners present more out of obligation than grief. the reading of the will that left her nothing but debts. The banker's widow, Mrs. Prudence Hartwell, taking her aside. "You could stay, dear, work in my household. It would be respectable." Respectable. The word had broken something inside her, sharp and final as snapped bone. She'd rather be a disreputable ghost wandering the territories than a respectable servant in the town where she'd been ground down to nothing. The trail began to climb, winding between sandstone formations that threw blessed shade. Margaret stopped to rest against a boulder still cool from the night, allowing herself 5 minutes reprieve. Her feet throbbed inside the boots, good leather, but made for town streets, not endless walking. Already, she could feel blisters forming, each step a small agony. From her vantage point, she could see the land spread out behind and before no sign of human habitation save the trail itself, worn by countless wheels and hooves. The isolation should have frightened her, but instead, she felt something unknot in her chest. For the first time in 3 years, she could breathe without wondering if she was breathing wrong, stand without calculating whether her posture might provoke correction. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the silence. Margaret watched its lazy spirals, envying its freedom, its mastery of the air. She'd been that free once, as a girl on her father's small ranch before the drought took everything, before mother died, before father decided his daughter needed a husband more than an education. The 5 minutes stretched to 10 before she forced herself upright. Time meant something different out here, measured not in clock chimes, but in the sun's arc, in the distance between water sources, in the rhythm of survival. She'd need to learn this new language quick if she meant to live. As she resumed walking, the carpet bag seemed heavier, though she knew that was fancy. Everything she owned, everything that proved she'd existed at all, weighed less than a sack of flour. The thought should have grieved her, but instead, it felt like liberation. Let the china cabinet and the horsehair sofa and the marriage bed with its memories of endured nights remain in Redemption Creek. She needed none of it. The cottonwoods proved further than she'd reckoned, but blessedly real. A thin stream wound between their roots, barely more than a trickle, but clear and cold. Margaret knelt at its edge, cupping water to her cracked lips, drinking deep before refilling the small canteen at her belt. She splashed her face, gasping at the shock of cold, then sat back on her heels to think. Night would come soon enough, and she'd need shelter. The trees offered some protection, but she'd heard enough stories to know that water drew all manner of creatures, four-legged and two-legged alike. Better to find higher ground, someplace defensible. Though what defense could she mount with nothing but her mother's sewing scissors and her own determination? As if in answer to her thoughts, she spotted a cluster of rocks upslope, forming a natural shelter beneath an overhanging cliff. It would do. It would have to. The climb tested muscles already weary from the day's journey. Her skirts caught on thorny scrub, tearing new rents in the already wounded fabric. By the time she reached the rocks, purple shadows stretched long across the land, and the temperature had begun its nightly plunge. The shelter proved better than she'd hoped, a shallow cave, really, with a sandy floor clear of animal sign. Previous travelers had used it. She could see the blackened remains of old campfires. Margaret gathered what dry wood she could find before darkness made the task impossible, her town-bred hands clumsy with the unfamiliar work. As stars began to prick the deepening sky, she huddled beside her small fire, the carpetbag serving as both pillow and protection for her few treasures. The vastness of the night pressed in, filled with sounds she couldn't identify, rustles and cries and the distant yip of coyotes. For the first time since leaving Redemption Creek, fear found her. Not the familiar fear of footsteps on the stairs or the turn of a doorknob, but something primal and honest. She was alone in the wilderness with $3 to her name and hundreds of miles to go. The courage that had carried her this far suddenly seemed a fragile thing, easy to lose in the darkness. But as she lay there, watching the fire paint shadows on stone, Margaret felt something else beneath the fear. in her chest, where Thomas's words had carved out hollows. Something new took root. Not hope exactly, that seemed too grand a word. Call it possibility. Call it the first breath of becoming someone other than who she'd been forced to be. Tomorrow would bring its own trials. Tonight, she was Margaret alone. Margaret deciding. Margaret surviving. The widow's weeds she wore were just cloth. Beneath them beat the heart of a woman who'd chosen the unknown over the unbearable. And that, at least, was a beginning. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the star-drunk sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and another answered. Margaret closed her eyes, her father's watch pressed against her ribs, counting heartbeats instead of hours. Whatever morning brought, she would meet it on her own terms. She was running toward something at last, instead of merely away. The canyon walls rose like cathedral spires on either side, red stone bleeding into shadow as the afternoon sun slanted westward. Margaret had been walking for 2 days since leaving her cave shelter, following a narrow deer trail that promised easier passage through the mountains. Her water ran low again, but the morning's clouds suggested rain might come, a mixed blessing in this country, where flash floods could kill as quick as thirst. She paused to catch her breath, one hand braced against the rough sandstone. The silence here went deeper than mere quiet. It pressed against her eardrums like water, broken only by the whisper of wind through stone. That's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong, the labored breathing of a horse, followed by a low groan, unmistakably human. Every instinct screamed at her to flee. She'd heard enough tales from the soldiers who'd passed through Redemption Creek, stories told with relish over whiskey about Apache raiders who showed no mercy. But the groan came again, weaker this time, carrying a quality of pain that transcended any divide between peoples. Margaret found herself creeping forward, keeping to the shadow of the canyon wall. The horse came into view first, a paint pony, sides heaving with exhaustion, reins tangled in a thorny mesquite. Beyond it, half hidden beneath a limestone overhang, lay its rider. Margaret's breath caught, even from 20 paces. She could see the dark stain spreading across his buckskin shirt, the unnatural angle of his body against the rocks. An Apache warrior. There was no mistaking the long black hair, the moccasins, the knife still sheathed at his belt. He appeared young, perhaps 30 summers, with strong features now slack with pain. His eyes were closed, chest rising and falling in irregular rhythm. Margaret pressed herself flat against the stone, heart hammering. She should leave, now, before he woke, before others came looking. This was none of her concern. She had troubles enough without borrowing more. But she didn't move. Instead, she found herself studying the scene with clearer eyes. No war paint marked his face. His weapons, the knife. A cavalry carbine lying just out of reach seemed defensive rather than aggressive. The wound appeared to be from a bullet, likely fired from distance. He'd been running from something, not toward it. The horse whickered softly, tugging against its tangled reins. The sound made the warrior stir, eyes fluttering open. They were dark as obsidian, clouded with fever and pain. For a moment, they stared at nothing. Then they found her. Margaret froze, their gazes locked across the 20 paces of sand and stone. She waited for him to cry out, to reach for a weapon, to do whatever warriors did when cornered. Instead, his eyes held hers with something that looked terribly like resignation. His lips moved, forming words in a language she didn't understand. Then, in accented English, "Go, not safe." The effort of speaking seemed to drain him. His eyes rolled back, body going limp once more. Fresh blood seeped through his fingers where he clutched his side. Margaret stood slowly, decision warring with sense. Every story she'd heard said to run. Apache meant death, meant torture, meant things proper ladies didn't speak of. But looking at him lying there, she saw not a savage, but a man. A dying man who'd used his breath to warn a stranger. Her mother's voice echoed from memory. "We are judged not by our fears, Margaret, but by what we do despite them. Before she could lose her nerve, she moved forward. The horse shied as she approached, but gentled when she spoke softly, the same nonsense words she'd used with her father's stock. She freed the reins carefully, led the exhausted animal to a scraggly juniper where she could secure it. The warrior hadn't moved. This close, she could see the fever flush on his bronze skin, the way his breathing came shallow and quick. The wound was high on his left side, still seeping red through his fingers. She'd seen enough hunting injuries on her father's ranch to know it needed tending soon, or infection would finish what the bullet had started. "Sir," the address seemed absurd under the circumstances, but she knew no other way to speak to a stranger. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes opened again, focusing with visible effort. This close, she could see they weren't pure black but deep brown, flecked with gold like river stones. Confusion flickered across his features. "Water," she said, unhooking her canteen. "You need water." He watched warily as she knelt beside him, supporting his head to help him drink. The first sip made him cough, spots of blood flecking his lips, but he managed a few more swallows before turning away. "Why?" The word came out harsh, accented but clear. "Why help?" It was the same question she'd been asking herself. Margaret sat back on her heels, considering. "Because you need it," she said finally. "Because I can." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or a weary kind of amusement. He gestured weakly at his wound. "Soldier bullet. They come back. You. Danger. Soldiers shot you." She couldn't keep the shock from her voice. The army was supposed to keep the peace, not shoot wounded men. His laugh was bitter, ending in a pained gasp. "Apache dog, they say." His English came in fragments, but the meaning was clear enough. "No trial, just—" He made a shooting gesture with his free hand. Margaret felt a familiar anger rise in her chest. The same feeling she'd had watching the good citizens of Redemption Creek turn blind eyes to her bruises. Justice, it seemed, was a luxury reserved for those deemed worthy of it. "Can you ride?" she asked, pushing the anger aside for practicality. He shook his head slightly. "Leave. You go. Not your fight." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She stood, brushing dust from her skirts, and looked around the canyon. "But I've been left to die before, in my own way. I won't do it to another." She set about gathering what she needed with the same methodical determination that had carried her away from Redemption Creek. Dry wood for a fire, though she'd wait for darkness to light it. Clean cloth torn from her spare petticoat. The small bottle of whiskey she'd taken from Thomas's study for medicinal purposes. She'd told herself, though she hadn't expected to need it so soon. The warrior watched through half-lidded eyes as she worked. When she returned with her supplies, he'd managed to prop himself more upright against the rock. The movement had cost him. Fresh sweat beaded his brow despite the cooling air. "Name," he said as she knelt beside him again. "Must know. Who saves?" "Margaret," she replied, then added, "Margaret Sullivan." "Margaret." He tested the syllables carefully. "I am Nantan." A pause, then, "Mean speaker. Speak for band. Speak to whites." His mouth twisted. "Not speak good enough today." "Your English is fine." She gestured at his blood-soaked shirt. "I need to see the wound." He nodded, understanding. With her help, he managed to remove the buckskin shirt, revealing a lean torso marked with old scars and new trauma. The bullet had entered just below his ribs, angling upward. No exit wound that she could see. The ball was still inside, then beyond her skill to remove. But she could at least clean and bind it. "This will hurt," she warned, uncorking the whiskey. "Pain is old friend." But his body went rigid when she poured the alcohol over the wound. A harsh breath hissing between clenched teeth. She worked quickly, efficiently, drawing on half-remembered lessons from her mother about herb poultices and proper bandaging. As she worked, he spoke in broken phrases, perhaps to distract himself from the pain. His band had been traveling to winter grounds, peaceful passage supposedly guaranteed by treaty, but treaties meant nothing to the patrol that had ambushed them at dawn. His wife, his young son. He didn't know if they'd escaped. He'd led the soldiers away, bought time with his life. Margaret's hands stilled for a moment. A wife, a child. Of course, men like this had families, had people who waited for them, worried for them, just as she'd once waited for Thomas to come home, though that waiting had turned from hope to dread soon enough. "They got away," she said firmly, resuming her work. "You bought them time. They got away." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing past the widow's weeds to something beneath. "You know loss," he said, not a question. "Yes." She tied off the bandage, sat back to inspect her work. "But I'm learning to know other things too." Night had crept into the canyon while she worked. The temperature dropped fast out here once the sun fled, and she could see him beginning to shiver despite the fever. She built the fire small, shielded by rocks, hoping the smoke would dissipate before rising high enough to mark their position. As the flames caught, she settled nearby, close enough to tend him if needed, but maintaining the proper distance that had been drilled into her since girlhood. Though what did propriety matter now? She'd already crossed every line of decent behavior simply by being here. "You should go," Nantan said again, though with less conviction. The firelight played across his features, softening the harsh lines of pain. "Soldiers come back. Track horse." "Then we'll hear them coming." She pulled her shawl tighter, surprised by her own calmness. "I'm not leaving you to die alone." Stubborn woman. But there was something almost like warmth in the words. "So I've been told," usually accompanied by harsher words. Words meant to break that stubbornness like a horse to bridle. But Thomas was gone, and his words had no power in this wild place. They sat in companionable silence as the fire crackled between them. Above, stars emerged in their multitudes, unmarred by city smoke or lamplight. Margaret had never seen so many, had never felt so small beneath their ancient gaze. Yet, somehow, the vastness comforted rather than overwhelmed. What were her troubles? What was any human struggle against such enduring light? Nantan dozed fitfully, mumbling occasionally in his own language. She kept the fire fed, the night watch, her ears tuned for any sound of pursuit. But the canyon held only the natural sounds of desert darkness, the rustle of small creatures, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through stone. As the night wore on, she found herself studying his face in the firelight, the strong jaw, the high cheekbones, the lines that spoke of laughter as much as hardship. So different from the men she'd known, yet fundamentally the same in his humanity. He bled red as anyone. He loved his family, feared for them, would die to protect them. The stories she'd heard seemed suddenly thin as paper, full of convenient monsters rather than complex men. How easy to make demons of those we wished to destroy. How necessary, perhaps, to avoid seeing the father in the warrior, the husband in the enemy. Near dawn, his fever broke. She knew by the way his breathing deepened, the restless movements stilling into genuine sleep. Exhaustion pulled at her too, but she fought it off. Someone had to keep watch. Someone had to witness that he lived. The eastern sky had just begun to pale when he woke, eyes clearer than they'd been since she found him. He looked at her rumpled, red-eyed with fatigue, still stubbornly present, and something like wonder crossed his features. "You stayed." "I said I would." He struggled to sit up, managing with her help. The movement clearly pained him, but the dangerous flush had left his skin. "Must go," he said. "Both! Soldiers!" She was already nodding, gathering their few supplies. She knew as well as he that they couldn't remain here, but as she helped him to his feet, supported his weight when he swayed, She realized that somewhere in the night, I had become we. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The small fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. They had traveled slowly through the day, Nantan leaning heavily on a makeshift walking stick, until they found this sheltered grove of cottonwoods near a trickling spring. Margaret had insisted they stop when she noticed fresh blood seeping through his bandages. Now, with new dressings applied and a rabbit roasting on a spit, Nantan had shown her how to set the snare. Despite his weakness, they sat in the gathering dusk like two souls at the edge of the world. The paint pony grazed nearby, its presence a comfort in the vast emptiness. "You waste water," Nantan said, watching her tear another strip from her petticoat to clean his wound. "Your dress grows smaller." "It was too long anyway," Margaret replied, not looking up from her work. "Kept catching on thorns." He made a sound that might have been amusement. "White women strange. Much cloth. No sense." "This white woman saved your life," she reminded him, but there was no heat in it. She'd learned over the past day that his gruff observations often masked pain, physical or otherwise. "Yes," his voice grew quieter. "This I wonder. Why?" She'd asked herself the same question a dozen times as they'd struggled through rough country, her supporting his weight when the path grew treacherous. The practical answer was that leaving him would have haunted her conscience, but sitting here in the firelight, with the vast indifference of the desert around them, she found herself speaking a deeper truth. "My husband died 2 months ago," she said, focusing on wrapping the bandage just so. "The whole town came to tell me what a good man he was, how blessed I'd been, how I should cherish his memory." Her hands stilled. Not one of them ever asked about the bruises. Not one ever wondered why such a blessed wife could barely meet their eyes. Nantan remained silent, but she felt his attention sharp as a blade. "When I found you, you were dying, but you used your strength to warn me away, to protect a stranger." She tied off the bandage, finally meeting his gaze. "My husband never used his strength for anything but hurt. So yes, I helped you, because you proved in that moment to be more worthy of life than he ever was." The confession hung between them, raw as an open wound. Margaret waited for judgment, for the disgust that surely must come. A woman speaking ill of her dead husband, admitting to such shameful things. "Among my people," Nantan said slowly, "a man who strikes his woman brings shame to his family. The Women's Council would cast him out, make him live alone until he learns to be human again." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Your people, they do not do this." "No." The word came out bitter. "They call it a private matter. Say a wife must submit to her husband's correction." "Correction," he tested the word, frowning. "Like training a horse." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "Very like that." His face darkened. "A man who must beat a woman to feel strong is no man. He is less than the dust." Tears stung her eyes, not of sadness, but of validation. In all the years of her marriage, no one had ever said such words to her. The minister had quoted scripture about wifely obedience. The doctor had tutted about her clumsiness. The sheriff's wife had whispered that she must try harder not to provoke. But this Apache warrior, this supposed savage, spoke her truth as simply as stating the sky was blue. "Thank you," she whispered. "No thanks needed for truth." He shifted, wincing, then gestured at the roasting rabbit. "But maybe you check our food, I think it burns." Grateful for the distraction, Margaret turned the spit, blinking away tears. They ate in companionable silence, sharing the meat and some berries Nantan had identified as safe. He showed her how to steep certain leaves in hot water to make a tea that would help with his pain and her exhaustion. As darkness deepened, he began to speak of other things. His English came easier now, though still fragmented. He told her of learning the white man's tongue as a youth, believing it would help his people navigate the changing world. How he'd served as interpreter, trying to build bridges between worlds that seemed determined to remain apart. My wife, Elu, means beautiful in our tongue. She says I am foolish. Says the whites will never see us as human. But I think—" He paused, searching for words. "I think there must be understanding for our children." "Your son," Margaret prompted gently. "You spoke of him before." "Kuruk, 5 winters old, quick like a rabbit, curious about everything." Pain flickered across his features, not physical this time. "I pray he is safe, that Elu found the others." "She did," Margaret said firmly. "A mother's love makes her strong. She got him to safety." Nantan looked at her strangely. "You have children?" "No." The old ache rose, but gentler than before. "It was a source of disappointment. To your husband. To everyone. A woman who cannot give her husband sons is considered broken." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Another failure to add to my collection." "My people believe children come when the spirits will it. Some women have many, some have none. Both are sacred." He paused. "But perhaps you will have children yet. You are young." Margaret almost laughed. After Thomas, the thought of another husband, another marriage bed, another set of hands that might turn cruel. "I think not," she said. "I'm done with husbands." The sound was non-committal. "The path ahead is long. Who knows what waits?" They prepared for sleep as they had the night before, close enough to share the fire's warmth, but with careful space between them. Nantan insisted she take his blanket despite her protests, pointing out with grim humor that fever kept him warm enough. But sleep eluded Margaret. Every sound made her start, wondering if it heralded soldiers or worse. Nantan seemed to sense her fear. "I keep watch," he said from his side of the fire. "Rest. You're injured. You need sleep more than I do." "I am warrior. Learned to sleep with one eye open before I could properly walk." His voice carried a hint of that dry humor she was beginning to recognize. "Besides, white woman who snores like angry bear will wake me if danger comes." "I do not snore," she protested, but found herself relaxing despite everything. "Like bear," he insisted. "Small bear, maybe badger." The absurdity of it, debating sleeping habits with a wounded Apache warrior in the middle of nowhere, struck her as so surreal. She actually laughed. Not the polite titter expected of ladies, but a real laugh that came from her belly. Nantan's teeth flashed white in the darkness. "Better," he said. "Laughter good medicine. My grandmother always said this." "Mine too," Margaret admitted, "though I haven't had much cause for it lately." "Then we make new causes." He shifted, getting comfortable against his saddle. "Tomorrow, I teach you to find water in dry places. Very useful. More useful than heavy dress. Are you going to critique my clothing choices the entire journey?" "Someone must. You dress for tea party, not survival." She threw a small pine cone at him, which he deflected with surprising agility for an injured man. "I'll have you know this is a very practical traveling dress." "For traveling to church, maybe." The banter felt strange after years of watching every word, weighing each statement for potential offense, but also liberating. Nantan gave as good as he got, showing no sign of the fragile ego she'd learned to navigate so carefully. They talked on as the fire burned low, trading stories of childhood, his tales of growing up following the seasons, learning to read the land like a book, made her own memories of her father's ranch seem tame by comparison. But he listened with genuine interest to her descriptions of barn raisings and harvest festivals, of her mother's garden and her father's stubborn mule. "Your father sounds like good man," he said when she described how her father had taught her to ride and shoot despite the neighbors' disapproval. "He was," Margaret agreed softly. "I think he would have liked you. He always said a man should be judged by his actions, not his appearance." "Wise, but rare among your people." "Rare among any people, I think." The moon rose full and bright, turning the landscape silver in its light. She could see Nantan's profile as he kept his promised watch, alert despite his weakness. There was something noble in it, not the false nobility that Thomas had worn like an ill-fitting coat. All posture and no substance, but something genuine. A man who kept his word even when it cost him. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "You speak of building bridges between our peoples, but they shot you. They tried to kill you for no reason but hate. How can you still believe in understanding?" He was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because the alternative is endless war, and in war, the children suffer most." He turned to look at her. "You helped me, even with fear, even with every story saying you should not. If one white woman can see Apache as human, perhaps others can too. Perhaps enough others to matter." "That's a lot of hope to place on, perhaps." "Hope is all we have sometimes. Hope and stubborn spirits who refuse to give up." His gaze held hers. "You understand this. I think—" She did understand. It was hope foolish. Desperate hope that had carried her away from Redemption Creek. Hope that somewhere beyond the horizon lay a life where she could breathe freely. "We should move again tomorrow," she said, changing the subject from things that cut too deep. "The soldiers." "Yes, but not soldiers only worry me now." His expression grew troubled. "My people will search too, and they may not wait for explanations if they find white woman with me." The implication chilled her more than the desert wind. She'd been so focused on avoiding the cavalry. She hadn't considered that Nantan's rescue might bring its own dangers. "What do we do?" "I signal them. Let them know I live. Travel willingly." He touched the bandage at his side. "But first, I must be strong enough to stand without swaying. They respect strength, not weakness." "Then we rest another day." Margaret decided, "Let you heal." "We have water for one day, maybe two." "Then I'll find more. You'll teach me. Remember how to find water in dry places." Something soft crossed his features. "You trust too easily." "No," she corrected. "I've learned not to trust at all. But you—" She gestured helplessly. "You're different." "Because I am Apache. Because you're decent. That seems rarer than water in this desert." He made that sound again, part laugh, part acknowledgement of pain. "Then we are two fools together, the Apache who believes in peace and the white woman who helps her enemies." "I prefer to think of us as optimists." "Optimists?" He tested the word. "Yes, armed with rabbit snares and torn petticoats." Margaret smiled, despite everything. "Don't forget my mother's sewing scissors. Very fierce." "Ah, yes, soldiers will tremble." They fell quiet again, but it was a comfortable quiet. The fire had burned to embers, the night deep around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to its pack, the sound lonely and wild and free. "Sleep, Margaret," Nantan said softly. "I watch. You are safe." And strange as it was, impossible as it should have been, she believed him. For the first time in years, she lay down without fear of what the night might bring. Her last thought before sleep took her was that she'd traveled hundreds of miles to escape one life, only to find herself building something entirely unexpected. Not just survival, not just alliance. Something that felt dangerously close to friendship. Dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold as Margaret carefully changed Nantan's bandages. The wound showed signs of healing, no festering, no red streaks of poison spreading beneath the skin. Her mother would have been proud of the neat stitching she'd managed with her sewing kit, though it was never meant for such grim purpose. "Better," Nantan confirmed, inspecting the wound with the detachment of a man long acquainted with injury. "You have healing hands." "Just steady ones," Margaret replied, but she felt a flush of pride. After years of being told she was good for nothing, competence tasted sweet as spring water. They'd been traveling together for 4 days now, falling into rhythms neither had expected. He taught her to read the land, how the flight of birds could signal water, how certain plants indicated good soil for digging roots, how to move quietly through rough country. She tended his wound, insisted on proper rest, and slowly coaxed more English from him through patient conversation. "Today, we reached the old trading post," Nantan said, pulling his shirt back on with care. "Abandoned now, but walls still stand. Good shelter." "How do you know it's abandoned?" "Because soldiers burned it. Man who ran it traded fair with Apache. This made him enemy." The bitterness in his voice had become familiar, though it never lasted long. Nantan seemed incapable of holding on to hatred, even when justified. They broke their simple camp, erasing signs of their presence with the thoroughness he'd taught her. Margaret's hands had roughened already, nails torn from digging roots and gathering firewood, but they were capable hands now. Useful hands. The wedding ring she'd removed that first night away from Redemption Creek had left only the faintest pale band of memory. As they walked, Nantan suddenly stopped, head tilted. Before Margaret could ask, he pulled her behind a cluster of boulders, finger to his lips. She heard it, then horses. Multiple riders moving fast. Her heart hammered as they crouched in the shadow of the rocks. Nantan had his knife out, though Margaret knew he was still too weak for real fighting. She gripped her scissors, absurd as they were as weapons. The riders passed within 50 yards Apache warriors, painted for war, moving with deadly purpose. Margaret barely breathed until the sound of hoofbeats faded into distance. "War party," Nantan said quietly, resheathing his knife. "Not from my band. They seek revenge for something. Always something now." He looked older suddenly, weighted by grief she couldn't fully grasp. "Would they have—" She couldn't finish the question. "Killed you, yes. Killed me too, for being with you." He stood carefully, testing his balance. "This is why peace is so hard. Too much blood already spilled. Everyone has reason for anger." They continued more cautiously, Nantan teaching her to watch for signs of riders. The land grew rougher, climbing into red rock country that looked like God's own sculpture garden. By noon, the abandoned trading post came into view, adobe walls half crumbled but still offering shelter, empty windows staring like hollow eyes. Inside, they found evidence of its violent end: charred beams, scattered bottles, a rust-stained counter where someone had made their last stand, but also unexpected bounty-canned goods overlooked by looters, a barrel with some flour still dry in the center, even a forgotten bottle of medicinal alcohol. "We stay tonight," Nantan decided. "Rest tomorrow. We must decide." "Decide what?" He lowered himself carefully onto a makeshift seat of fallen timber. "Where you go, where I go, if we go together or apart." The question she'd been avoiding hung between them now, unavoidable. Margaret busied herself exploring their shelter to hide her sudden uncertainty. In the back room, she discovered something that made her gasp: books, water-damaged and mouse-chewed, but books nonetheless. She carried them out like treasure. "The trader's wife must have lived here," she said, laying them carefully in a patch of sunlight to dry. "Look, poetry, a Bible, even a dictionary." Nantan picked up the poetry volume, handling it with surprising gentleness. "My father would have liked this. He kept the old stories, said words were power." He opened it carefully, studying the cramped print. "I cannot read these marks well, some mission school, but—" He shrugged. "I could teach you," Margaret offered without thinking, then flushed. "I mean, if you wanted, if we travel together longer." He finished her thought, setting the book aside. "This is the question. Yes, what are we to each other now?" She knew what he meant. The careful boundaries they'd maintained were necessary when he was injured, when survival took all focus. But now they had to choose. "In your world, I cannot be," he said simply. "Apache man in White Town means jail or rope. In my world, you would be—" He searched for words. "Captive. Never trusted, always watched." "Then neither world." The words came out fierce as her decision crystallized. There's land beyond the territories, places where people go to disappear, where nobody asks about the past. You would go into unknown with Apache man, your people would say you are ruined. I was ruined the day I married Thomas Sullivan, she said flatly. Everything since has been resurrection. He studied her for a long moment. You speak of traveling as friends. There it was, the other question. The one that propriety demanded they not acknowledge. The awareness that had grown between them, evident in lingering glances and careful distances maintained. Margaret found herself without words. How could she explain that she'd felt more respected in 5 days with this wounded warrior than in 3 years of marriage, that his rough kindness had begun healing wounds she'd thought permanent? I don't know what I speak of. I only know I'm not ready to be alone again. And I, he said slowly, I am tired of being angry, tired of fighting, with you. I remember other ways to be. They prepared their meal in silence, heavy with unspoken possibilities. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Nantan surprised her by picking up the poetry book again. This teaching, he said, show me. So she did. They sat side by side in the doorway, catching the last good light as she guided his finger along the lines. He knew more than he'd claimed the mission school had given him basics, but reading English proved trickier than speaking it. The words dance away, he complained after struggling through a simple verse. In my language, we speak poetry, not trap it on paper. Then speak some, Margaret encouraged. I'd like to hear. He was quiet for a moment, then began to speak in Apache liquid sounds that rose and fell like water over stones. When he finished, she waited expectantly. It tells of the first sunrise, he translated haltingly. How Coyote stole light from the sky spirits to give to the people, but the light was too heavy to carry all, so he broke it. Pieces became stars, and the largest piece became sun. He smiled slightly. My grandmother told it better. It's beautiful. She meant it. Will you teach me? Apache words. He looked surprised. Why would white women want such knowledge? Because they're your words. Because they matter. She touched the book between them. You're trying to enter my world through these marks. Shouldn't I try to enter yours? Something shifted in his expression. You are unusual woman, Margaret. So I'm told. But from him, it sounded like praise. As darkness fell, they built their fire in the old hearth, grateful for walls between them and the desert wind. Margaret had found a dented pot and managed a simple stew from their supplies. They ate companionably, trading stories of childhood meals, her mother's cornbread, his grandmother's acorn cakes. I have been thinking, Nantan said as they cleaned their few dishes, about what you said. Land beyond territories. There is Place Valley hidden in far mountains. My cousin went there, married Mexican woman. They raise horses, keep to themselves. Others 2 people who don't fit in either world. A place for misfits, Margaret said, testing the idea. Better than being alone. He paused, seemed to gather courage. If we go together, you understand it would not be simple. Nothing about my life has been simple since I left Redemption Creek. No. He moved closer. Close enough that she could see the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. I mean, in this valley, they would see us as married, no priest, no paper, but married in ways that matter. This is acceptable to you. Margaret's breath caught. Not at impropriety, she'd left such concerns miles behind, but at the magnitude of what he offered. Not ownership, as Thomas had claimed, not submission, as her world demanded, but partnership, chosen freely by 2 souls who'd found each other in the wilderness. I buried one husband, she said carefully. I swore I'd never take another. I do not ask you to take, I ask you to choose. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her face with fingers gentle as moth wings. Choose to walk beside, choose to share fire, choose to build something new from ashes of old lives. She leaned into his touch, starved for tenderness after years of its absence. The world would call it madness. Let them. We make our own world. Your people, your wife. Elu is gone. Soldiers saw to that. Fresh grief flickered across his features. I searched after, found where they... He stopped, composed himself. She would want me to live, to find peace. She was always wiser than me in such things. Margaret took his hand, feeling the calluses of a life lived hard but honestly. And my husband is gone. May he find in death the peace he never gave in life. Then we are two who have lost finding each other. He squeezed her fingers gently. This could be enough. Yes, to start. Yes, she whispered. It could be enough. They sat together as the fire burned low, hands linked, adjusting to this new geography between them. Not passion, not yet, but something that might grow into it given time and trust. For now, it was enough to not be alone, to face the uncertain future with another soul who understood loss and the desperate hope of beginning again. I do not know how to be husband in your way, Nantan admitted. The white man's rules confuse me. Then don't be husband in their way. Be partner in ours. Ours? He tested the word, smiled. Yes, I like this better. Outside, wind sang through the empty windows, carrying the scent of sage and coming rain. But inside, in their circle of firelight, two broken people began the careful work of building something whole. What do you call me? Margaret asked suddenly. In your language, he thought for a moment. Iskani. It means she who chooses her path. It fits, I think. Iskani, she repeated, mangling the pronunciation. And Nantan, speaker for his people. Once, now just speaker to you. He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture that seemed to surprise them both. We leave at dawn, find this valley. At dawn, she agreed, together. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing on adobe walls that had seen other dreams born and broken. But tonight, they sheltered something new, fragile as spring grass, stubborn as desert blooms, real as the two hearts learning to beat in time. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the abandoned trading post. They'd been talking for hours, sharing pieces of themselves like traders exchanging precious goods. The desert wind whistled through gaps in the adobe walls, but inside their circle of warmth, the sound seemed distant as another world. Tell me about her, Margaret said softly. Elu, if it doesn't pain you too much. Nantan stared into the dying flames, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then she laughed like water over stones, always laughing, even when times grew hard, said I thought too much, worried about tomorrow when today had gifts enough. His voice carried love and loss in equal measure. She made our wiki up a place of joy, even with soldiers coming closer, even with hunger winters. She found reasons to smile. She sounds wonderful. She was strong like mountain, gentle like morning rain. He paused, selecting memories with care. When I first brought white man's words to our band, many said I betrayed the old ways. Elu defended me, said knowing enemy's language was wisdom, not weakness. Margaret understood that kind of strength, the quiet courage of standing beside someone when the world stood against them. Though, in her case, she'd stood alone. How did you meet? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. At gathering of bands, summer of my 18th year, she outran all the young men in races, wounded my pride terrible. The smile grew. So I challenged her to rematch, lost again, and again. Finally, she took pity, said she would teach me her secret if I stopped making fool of myself. What was her secret? She said it was the way she talked to the wind, but I think real secret was making me chase her until she decided to be caught. His expression softened. 3 horses I paid her father, would have paid 30. Margaret found herself smiling despite the sadness of it. This was love as it should be chosen freely, celebrated joyfully. So different from her own experience of being handed from father to husband like property changing hands. "Your turn," Nantan said. "Tell me how you met your husband." The smile faded. "Thomas Sullivan came to buy horses from my father. I served tea. A week later, he asked for my hand. Father was struggling, drought had killed half our stock, and Thomas offered to pay off his debts." She picked at a loose thread on her skirt. "I was 17. I thought it romantic, being saved by a prosperous man. But he did not save." "No, he collected. There's a difference." She drew her knees up, making herself smaller. "The first months weren't terrible. He could be charming when it suited him. It was only after the wedding debts were paid, when I had nowhere to run, that he showed his true nature." "When did you know you would leave?" Margaret considered. The moment came slowly, then all at once, like water wearing away stone. "One morning, I woke to find him gone on business. I stood in my perfect parlor, in my perfect house, wearing bruises hidden by perfect clothes, and realized I was disappearing. Each day, there was less of me. Eventually, there would be nothing left but a shell that looked like Margaret Sullivan." "So you chose to live." "I chose to try." She met his eyes across the fire. "I'm still learning what that means." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds beyond the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a pack of coyotes called to each other wild voices that seemed to mock the very notion of walls and boundaries. "I need to tell you about Kuruk," Nantan said suddenly. "My son, before we go further, you should know." Margaret waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. "5 winters old. I said, 'This is true, but there is more.'" He took a breath. "The soldiers came at dawn. I was scouting ahead, Elu and Kuruk with main band. When I heard shots, I rode back fast. Too late." His hands clenched and unclenched. "I found Elu. She had run, tried to lead them away from others. They shot her in the back. But Kuruk I searched until soldiers almost caught me. No sign, no body." "He could have escaped," Margaret said urgently. "Children can hide in small places." "This is my hope. Others from bands scattered to 4 winds. Maybe someone took him, keeps him safe. Maybe he lives with another band now. Maybe—" He shook his head. "Maybe is all I have. But if he lives, someday I will find him. This you must know. If we make life together, this search is part of it." "Of course it is." The response came immediate. "Fierce. He's your son. We'll look for him together." Nantan stared at her, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "You would help search for Apache child, take him as yours if we find him." "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I thought white women have strong feelings about blood, about proper families." "I've had a proper family," Margaret said flatly. "Proper house, proper marriage, proper misery. If I'm choosing an improper life, let it at least be filled with love." He moved then, shifting around the fire until he sat beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth against the night's chill. "You surprise me, Iskani. Always surprise. Good surprises, I hope." "The best kind." He hesitated, then asked, "What of your own hopes for children?" The old wound ached, but softer now. 3 years of marriage, no babies. The doctor said I was built wrong somehow. Thomas blamed me, of course. Said I was defective. She pulled her shawl tighter. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps doctor was fool. Nantan said sharply. Many reasons for no children. Sometimes bodies need time. Sometimes spirits must heal first. Sometimes man is problem, not woman, though they never admit this. Margaret looked at him in surprise. It had never occurred to her or to anyone in Redemption Creek that Thomas might have been the defective one. My uncle and his wife had no children for 7 winters. Nantan continued. Then 3 came, fast like rabbits. Bodies are mysterious. Only the spirits know their timing. But if I couldn't, then we would be two who chose each other. This is enough. Children are gift, not requirement. He paused. Though I hope to find Kuruk, this hope I cannot release. I wouldn't want you to. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of recognition. Here was a man who valued children without seeing women as mere vessels for producing them. We'll find him, Nantan, somehow. You speak like it is certain. Hope is certain. The rest, we'll figure out as we go. He smiled then, that rare full smile that transformed his stern features. Practical and dreamer both. Dangerous combination. Says the Apache who quotes poetry and believes in peace. We make good pair of fools, yes. The very best kind. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of rain. Nantan lifted his head, reading signs she was only beginning to recognize. Storm coming. Good. We'll hide our tracks when we leave. You're still worried about the soldiers. Soldiers? Yes. Also others. That war party today troubles me. If they attack settlers, Army will strike back at any Apache they find. Peace and war look the same to blind eyes. Margaret thought of the cycles of violence, how each death demanded another, how grief became rage, became revenge, became grief again. How do we break it? The killing. By living different, by showing another way is possible. He turned to her, expression serious. This valley I spoke of, it is not paradise. Hard work, hard choices. But people there, they try to build something new. Apache and Mexican and white and others. All mixed, all choosing peace over old hatreds. It sounds like a dream. Maybe, but better to chase dreams than run from nightmares. No, she couldn't argue with that. Her whole journey had been flight from nightmare. Perhaps it was time to run towards something instead. There's something else, Nantan said carefully. About going to this valley. About us. Margaret waited, hearing the weight in his voice. Among my people, when man and woman choose each other, there are ceremonies, words spoken, gifts given, but here, now, we have only ourselves. He reached into his pouch, drew out something small. This was Elu's. I would be honored, if you would accept it. In his palm lay a silver bracelet, delicately worked with symbols she couldn't read. Turquoise stones caught the firelight like captured sky. I can't, Margaret breathed. It was hers. She would want it worn, not hidden, want it to know love again. He took her hand gently. In our way, when woman accepts gift, she accepts man who gives it, not as property, as chosen one. Margaret stared at the bracelet, understanding the moment's gravity. This wasn't Thomas sliding a ring onto her finger while she stood numb in her wedding dress. This was choice, real and present, and hers to make. What would I give in return? I have nothing of value. You have yourself. This is all I ask. Her hand trembled as she extended her wrist. Nantan slipped the bracelet on with careful reverence. It fit perfectly, as if made for her. Now we speak words, he said softly. I speak in my language, you in yours. Heart understands even when ears do not. He began to speak in Apache liquid sounds that rose and fell like music. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear promise, devotion, hope for shared tomorrows. When he finished, she found her own words. Margaret, just Margaret, no other name choose you, Nantan. Not because I must, not because I'm told, but because my heart recognizes yours. I promise to walk beside you, to search for your son as my own, to build something new from the ashes of what we've lost. I promise to be partner, not possession, to give trust and truth in equal measure. This I choose, freely and gladly. He lifted her hand, pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist where the bracelet rested warm against her pulse. Now we are bound, not by white man's law or Apache law, but by choice. This is strongest law of all. The first drops of rain began to fall. pattering against the broken roof. They moved their supplies to the most sheltered corner, spreading blankets against the wall. For the first time since they'd met, they lay down side by side, no careful distance between them. Nantan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her back against his chest, and Margaret felt something tight and fearful finally release. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she admitted, "but not of you, of hoping too much, of believing this could be real. Then we be afraid together, but still we go forward." "Still we go forward," she agreed. Lightning illuminated the desert beyond their shelter, revealing the vast unknown that waited. In the morning, they would face that uncertainty together. They would search for a valley that might not exist, a peace that might not hold, a child who might not be found. They would build a life that no one would understand or approve. But tonight, in this moment, Margaret felt Nantan's heartbeat against her back, steady and sure. She felt the weight of Elu's bracelet, freely given and freely received. She felt the blessing of rain washing away their tracks, granting them clean passage into whatever tomorrow held. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. They had been traveling for 6 days since leaving the trading post, following ancient paths known only to those who read the land like scripture. Nantan's strength had returned gradually, though Margaret still caught him favoring his wounded side when he thought she wasn't watching. The paint pony carried their meager supplies while they walked, a rhythm established without discussion, her hand sometimes resting on his arm for balance on rough terrain, his steadying her when loose stones shifted beneath her feet. The land had changed as they climbed higher into the mountains. Desert gave way to juniper and pinon, then to towering ponderosa pines that whispered secrets in the wind. They'd seen no one for days, moving like ghosts through a world that seemed to exist outside of time. But now, as they crested a ridge in the late afternoon sun, Nantan suddenly tensed. His hand went to her arm, guiding her behind the thick trunk of a pine. Below them, in a narrow valley cut by a crystal stream, smoke rose from multiple campfires. "Riders," he said quietly, eyes scanning the scene with practiced wariness. "White men, 8, maybe 10. Margaret peered around the tree, heart sinking. Even from this distance, she could see the purposeful way they moved, the weapons prominently displayed. These weren't ordinary travelers. "Bounty hunters," Nantan confirmed her fears. "Or worse, they search for something, someone." As if in answer to his words, one of the men dragged a figure into view, a woman, hands bound, dress torn. She fell to her knees by the fire, and even from the ridge, they could hear harsh laughter. "We have to," Margaret started, but Nantan was already shaking his head. "Too many, armed. I have knife and weak gun. You have scissors. We die. She still suffers." The practical truth of it burned. But before Margaret could respond, movement below caught their attention. The woman had lurched to her feet, running toward the stream. She'd made it perhaps 20 yards before they caught her, dragging her back roughly. "Wait," Nantan breathed, leaning forward. "Her hair." Margaret saw it then. As the woman struggled, her bonnet fell away, revealing long black hair that marked her as native. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. These men were slave traders, hunting human cargo for the markets that still thrived despite laws against them. "She's Apache," Nantan said, voice tight with controlled rage. "Young, maybe from scattered band." They watched helplessly as the men secured their captive more thoroughly, posting guards while others prepared food. The casual cruelty of it conducting evil business as routinely as any trade made Margaret's stomach turn. "There must be something we can do," she whispered. Nantan studied the camp with calculating eyes. "Not direct, but maybe." He pointed to their horses, hobbled upstream from the camp. "Horses scatter. They must chase, in confusion." "It's dangerous." "Yes, but leaving her is worse." He looked at Margaret intently. "You do not have to—" "We're partners," she interrupted. "Remember, your fights are mine now." Something fierce and grateful flashed in his eyes. "Then we wait for darkness. Plan carefully. One chance only." They retreated from the ridge, finding shelter in a grove of aspens where they could watch the valley without being seen. As shadows lengthened, they prepared. Nantan showed her how to move silently, where to place her feet, how to blend with darkness. Margaret practiced until her muscles ached, determined not to be the weakness that destroyed their plan. "If something goes wrong," Nantan said as night fell, "you run, no hesitation. Promise this." "I promise to use my judgment," Margaret countered. "That's the best you'll get." He almost smiled. Stubborn woman. "So you keep saying." When full darkness came, punctuated only by the slavers' fires, they moved. Margaret had never felt so aware of her body every breath, every heartbeat seeming loud as thunder. But Nantan's training held. She placed her feet where he showed her, moved when wind-covered sound, froze when stillness was required. The horses were their first goal. Nantan produced a length of rawhide, fashioning it into a simple whip. At his signal, Margaret began cutting hobbles while he moved to the far side of the herd. Her hands shook, but the sharp scissors did their work. Then Nantan's whip cracked like lightning, and chaos erupted. The horses bolted in all directions, whinnying in alarm. Men shouted, scrambling from bedrolls, cursing the darkness and each other. "Get them horses," someone bellowed. "They's worth more than gold." In the confusion, two figures slipped through shadows toward where the Apache woman sat tied to a wagon wheel. Margaret kept watch while Nantan worked at her bonds with swift efficiency. The woman's eyes went wide with shock, then hope. "Who?" she began in accented English. "Friends," Nantan whispered. "Run when I say, up valley, find tall pines split by lightning. We meet there." Shouts grew closer. Someone had brought a torch, swinging it wildly. Margaret tugged at Nantan's sleeve urgently. "Now," he hissed. They scattered in 3 directions. Margaret heard the woman's bare feet pattering into darkness, heard Nantan moving opposite to draw pursuit. She ran her own path, skirts hiked high, dodging between trees as voices raised behind them. "The squaw's gone. She's gone." "Find her. She's worth 2 months' wages." "Check the trees. They can't have gone far." Margaret ran until her lungs burned, then pressed herself into a hollow between massive roots, trying to quiet her gasping breath. Footsteps crashed through underbrush nearby. Torchlight flickered between trees, searching. "Anything," a voice called. Nothing, like they turned into spirits. "Spirits don't cut ropes." Someone helped her. The search continued for what felt like hours. Margaret remained frozen, every muscle cramping, until finally the sounds faded back toward the valley. Even then, she waited longer, remembering Nantan's teachings about patience. When she finally emerged, the moon had risen, providing enough light to navigate. She made her way carefully to the lightning-struck pine, heart hammering with new fears. What if they'd been caught? What if— "Iskani." Relief flooded her at Nantan's voice. He materialized from shadow, and she had to resist the urge to throw herself into his arms. Behind him stood the Apache woman, young as he'd guessed, perhaps 18, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "This is Ayana," Nantan said. "She speaks some English. I told her you are my woman, that we travel to Hidden Valley." Ayana studied Margaret with frank curiosity. "White woman chooses Apache man chooses this life." "I choose him," Margaret said simply. "The life we build together." Something in Ayana's expression softened. "Then you are brave or foolish?" "Both," Nantan said dryly. "Come, we must go far before dawn. They will search." They traveled through the night, Ayana setting a punishing pace despite her ordeal. She'd been taken 3 days ago. She told them in fragments as they walked, Her family group had been surprised at dawn. She'd seen her mother fall, didn't know if others escaped. The slavers meant to take her to Mexico, where Apache women brought high prices. "You risk much for stranger," she said to Margaret during a brief rest. "You're not a stranger. You're a woman in need. That's all that matters." Ayanna was quiet for a moment. "Your man teaches you our ways." I'm a poor student." "No, you learn what matters. Heart first, words later." She glanced at Nantan with something like approval. "He chooses well." As dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold, they finally stopped in a sheltered canyon where a spring bubbled from rock. All three were exhausted, but safe for now. While Nantan stood watch, Margaret tended to Ayanna's rope burns and torn feet, sharing what food they had. "Why do you go to Hidden Valley?" Ayanna asked. Margaret looked to Nantan, who nodded. "To find peace," she said. "To build something new, away from those who would separate us." "And you trust this dream?" "I trust him," Margaret said, surprising herself with the simple truth of it. "And he trusts me. It's enough to start." Ayanna was quiet for a long time. Then, "My mother spoke of this valley, said desperate people find it when need is great, said spirits guide those meant to arrive." "Will you come with us?" Margaret asked. "You'd be welcome." The young woman's eyes filled with tears, the first she'd shown. "I have nowhere else. Family gone. Band scattered." She straightened, wiping her face roughly. "Yes, I come. Better than being alone." They rested through the heat of the day, taking turns watching for pursuit that never came. The slavers, it seemed, had decided one escaped captive wasn't worth venturing deeper into Apache territory. As afternoon shadows grew long, Ayanna surprised them by laughing a sound like bells after so much darkness. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "I think of their faces. Big men with guns. Cannot catch two Indians and small white woman with scissors." She laughed again. "Story will shame them always." Nantan smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Scissors very fierce. I keep saying this." "You mock me," Margaret protested, but she was smiling too. "Never." But his eyes danced with rare humor. "Partners. Remember, I provide strength. You provide sharp things and stubborn spirit." "And healing hands." Ayanna added, "Do not forget, these feet would not walk far without tending." As they prepared to continue their journey, Margaret realized their small band had grown. What had been two souls seeking refuge had become three. Perhaps this was how it happened, not through grand design, but through small choices. One person at a time choosing trust over fear, compassion over safety. The valley still lay days ahead, perhaps weeks. They would face more dangers, more challenges. But looking at her companions, Nantan checking his weapons with practiced ease, Ayanna braiding her hair with determined fingers, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected. Hope, not just for survival, but for something richer. A family born not of blood, but of choice. A future written not by others' expectations, but by their own hands. "Ready?" Nantan asked, extending his hand to help her rise. She took it, feeling Elu's bracelet warm against her wrist. "Ready?" They set off into the growing dusk. Three unlikely allies bound by circumstance and choosing to remain bound by something stronger. Behind them lay slavery and cruelty and the ugly face of civilization. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. It was enough. It was everything. The child appeared at dawn like a spirit from the mist, standing motionless at the edge of their camp. Margaret woke to find those dark eyes watching her solemn. Ancient eyes in a face that couldn't have seen more than 6 winters. Her heart stopped, then raced. The child was clearly native, with tangled black hair and torn clothing that spoke of days alone in the wilderness. "Nantan," she whispered, not daring to move too quickly. He was already awake, had probably sensed the presence before she did. Ayanna stirred as well, then went very still at the sight of the small figure. Apache child, Nantan said softly in his own language, then repeated in English for Margaret. But not from my band. The beadwork is different. The child, a girl, Margaret thought, though it was hard to tell, remained perfectly still, like a fawn deciding whether to flee or trust. She clutched something in her small fist, and Margaret could see scratches on her arms, evidence of a hard journey through thorny country. Hello, Margaret said gently, using the Apache greeting Nantan had taught her. The pronunciation was certainly wrong, but the child's eyes widened slightly. Ayana moved slowly, reaching for their water pouch. She spoke in Apache, her voice soft as summer rain. The child's grip on whatever she held loosened slightly. She asks if we are spirits. Ayana translated. She has walked many days, her people. A pause, more gentle words exchanged. Gone. Soldiers came. Margaret's heart clenched. Another orphan of this endless violence. She thought of Karuk, Nantan's son, somewhere in this vast land, perhaps equally lost and alone. Nantan knelt, making himself smaller, less threatening. He spoke in Apache, and Margaret caught Karuk's name among the flowing words. The child stepped closer, drawn perhaps by the pain in his voice that needed no translation. I told her I search for my own child, he explained quietly, that we understand loss. The little girl opened her fist then, revealing a small carved wooden horse, painted with fading designs. She held it out toward them, not offering it, just showing what remained of her world. May I see? Margaret asked, extending her hand palm up. After a long moment, the child placed the horse in Margaret's palm. It was beautifully made, worn smooth by small fingers. Margaret admired it solemnly before handing it back. Hungry? She asked, miming eating. The girl nodded, the first crack in her perfect stillness. Ayana was already preparing food, dried meat soaked in water to soften it, berries they'd gathered the day before. The child fell on the meal with desperate hunger but forced herself to eat slowly, showing remarkable self-control for one so young. What's your name? Margaret asked when the edge of hunger had been dulled. The child looked between them uncertainly. Finally, she whispered, Sheila. Sheila, Margaret repeated carefully. That's beautiful. I'm Margaret. She pointed to the others. Nantan, Ayana. As the morning progressed, the child's story emerged in fragments. Her band had been camped near a river when soldiers attacked without warning. Her mother had pushed her into a hollow log, told her to stay hidden no matter what she heard. She'd obeyed, emerging only when silence fell. Everyone was gone, dead or fled. She didn't know which. She'd walked toward the mountains because her grandmother once said safety lived in high places. How many days? Nantan asked gently. Sheila held up one hand, fingers spread. 5 days. A 6-year-old child had survived 5 days alone in the wilderness, guided by nothing but her grandmother's words and her own fierce will to live. Margaret blinked back tears, marveling at the strength contained in such a small frame. When she'd been 6, she'd cried over a skinned knee. This child had endured unimaginable loss and kept walking. She comes with us, Margaret said, not asking but stating. Nantan and Ayana both nodded. There was no question. Really, the spirits had brought this child to them for a reason. But Sheila had survived by being wary. She watched them throughout the morning, accepting food and water but maintaining careful distance. When they prepared to travel, she followed but wouldn't let anyone touch her or carry her when the path grew steep. It was Margaret who finally broke through, quite by accident. As they rested during the heat of midday, she pulled out her sewing scissors to trim a loose thread. The sun caught the metal, sending light dancing across the rocks. Sheila's eyes went wide with wonder. Pretty, the child whispered in English, her first word beyond her name. Would you like to see? Margaret offered the scissors carefully. Handles first. Sheila took them with reverent hands, turning them to catch the light. For a moment, She was just a little girl, fascinated by something shiny, not a survivor carrying unbearable loss. "My mother had something shiny," she said in halting English mixed with Apache words Ayanna translated. "Made music when wind blew." "Chimes," Margaret said softly. "Wind chimes." Sheila nodded, handing back the scissors with visible reluctance. On impulse, Margaret dug into her pack, pulling out a small hand mirror, one of the few vanities she'd allowed herself when packing. "Here," she said, giving it to the child. "You can make light dance with this." Sheila's face transformed with the first real smile they'd seen. She experimented with the mirror, sending light skittering across canyon walls onto Nantan's face, making him mock scowl, which drew a tiny giggle. From that moment, the dynamic shifted. Sheila attached herself to Margaret like a shadow, though she remained fascinated by all three adults. She walked between Margaret and Ayanna, occasionally accepting a boost over difficult terrain. When they camped that night, she settled close to their fire, no longer poised to flee. "She chooses you," Nantan said quietly to Margaret as they watched Ayanna teaching the child a string game. "Children know who is safe." "I don't know anything about raising children," Margaret confessed. "Especially a child who's been through such trauma. You know kindness. You know patience. Rest comes with time." He paused, watching Sheila's small fingers work the string. "She reminds me of Karuk at that age. So serious, but light underneath waiting to shine." They were 3 days deeper into the mountains when Sheila began to speak more freely. Her English was limited but supplemented by Apache that Ayanna translated and an expressive use of gestures that needed no words. She showed them which plants her grandmother had taught her were safe to eat, demonstrated how to find water-bearing cacti, proved herself far more capable than any 6-year-old should need to be. But at night, the strong facade crumbled. Margaret woke to muffled sobs, found Sheila curled into the smallest possible ball. Shaking with grief she couldn't contain any longer. Without thinking, Margaret gathered the child into her arms, rocking her as her own mother had once rocked her. "Shh, little one, you're safe. You're not alone anymore." Sheila clung to her, tears soaking Margaret's dress. She cried until exhaustion took her, falling asleep still hiccuping against Margaret's chest. Even in sleep, her grip remained tight, as if afraid Margaret might disappear like everyone else she'd loved. Nantan draped a blanket over them both, his hand briefly touching Margaret's hair in a gesture of support. She looked up to find his eyes bright with unshed tears. "This is how it was with Karuk," he said roughly. "After his first hunt, when he understood what death meant, the strong days, then the breaking, he settled beside them, close enough to provide warmth and protection. You do well with her." "I'm terrified," Margaret admitted. "What if I fail her? What if—" "What if you don't?" Ayanna interrupted from her bedroll. "What if you're exactly what she needs, white woman who chose Apache man, who sees her as child first, not Apache or white or anything else?" Margaret looked down at Sheila's tear-stained face, now peaceful in sleep. The weight of this small life in her arms felt both overwhelming and absolutely right. She'd left Redemption Creek believing herself incapable of motherhood, broken in some fundamental way. But perhaps Thomas had been wrong about that, as he'd been wrong about so many things. Perhaps motherhood wasn't about blood, or proper marriages, or perfect homes. Perhaps it was about this holding a broken child through the darkness, promising with your whole heart that tomorrow would be better. "She'll need all of us," Margaret said finally, "to learn both worlds, to find her place between them. Then she will have all of us." Nantan promised. This is how families are made in difficult times, not just by birth, but by choice. The next morning brought a gift. Sheila woke to find Nantan had carved a new animal for her, a small wolf, to keep her horse company. Her smile was like sunrise after storm. She cradled both animals carefully, then surprised them all by walking to Nantan and placing her small hand in his. "You carry?" she asked in careful English. "Too tall for walking." He lifted her onto his shoulders with infinite gentleness, and she laughed, really laughed for the first time since they'd found her. The sound echoed off canyon walls like a blessing. They traveled that day as something new, not just a group of survivors, but the beginning of a family. Sheila rode on various shoulders, chattering more freely, teaching Margaret Apache words for everything they passed. When they stopped to rest, she helped gather firewood with industrious determination. At meals, she made sure everyone had food before eating her own share. "She mothers us," Ayana observed with amusement. 6 years old and making sure we eat properly. It was true. Sheila had appointed herself caretaker as much as cared for, finding purpose in small acts of helping. Margaret recognized the impulse after loss. Sometimes the only way forward was to focus on what you could do for others. That night, as they sat around their small fire, Sheila produced her wooden horse and Nantan's wolf. She made them run across the sandy ground, creating soft neighing and howling sounds. Then she looked up at Margaret with those 2 old eyes. "Story," she asked. "About horses." Margaret glanced at the others, then began, "Once there was a horse who loved to run. She ran so fast that the wind itself grew jealous." As she wove the tale, embellishing as she went, Sheila leaned against her side, playing out the story with her carved animals. Ayana added details about the sky spirits. Nantan provided sound effects that made Sheila giggle. When the story ended with the horse and wind becoming friends, racing together across the sky as shooting stars, Sheila sighed contentedly. "More tomorrow," she asked hopefully. "Every night if you want," Margaret promised. As they settled for sleep, Sheila positioned herself carefully between Margaret and Ayana, but reached out to touch Nantan's hand too, making sure all her people were close. The gesture spoke volumes about resilience, about the human heart's capacity to trust again even after devastating loss. Margaret lay awake long after the others slept, Sheila's small hand clutched in hers. She thought about the strange paths that had led them all here: a widow fleeing abuse, a warrior seeking peace and his lost son, a young woman escaped from slavers, and now this remarkable child who'd walked out of tragedy into their makeshift family. None of it made sense by the world's logic, but under the vast canopy of stars, with the warmth of found family around her, Margaret thought perhaps the world's logic was overrated. Perhaps the only logic that mattered was this: they had found each other. They would not let go. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The valley still lay ahead. Kuruk remained lost, and a child's grief would need patient tending. But tonight, Sheila slept safely between guardians who would die before letting harm touch her again. It was not the family any of them had planned. It was the family they were choosing to become. The riders appeared at sunset, silhouetted against the blood-red sky like harbingers of judgment. Margaret counted 6 of them, moving with the deliberate pace of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. She recognized the lead rider even at a distance: Samuel Morrison, Redemption Creek's self-appointed moral guardian and the man who'd tried to buy Thomas's widow for his own purposes. They'd made camp in a box canyon, the high walls offering protection but also trapping them. Nantan had scouted it earlier, deemed it safe for the night. Now those same walls felt like a cage. "Take Sheila," Nantan said quietly, already checking his weapons. "Back of canyon, there's a crevice. Hide there." "We're not leaving you," Margaret said fiercely. "Not leaving, being smart." He caught her shoulders, eyes intense. "They want you, not me. If they take you back." He didn't finish, didn't need to. Ayana was already gathering Sheila, who'd gone silent and watchful at the first sign of danger. The child's survival instincts, honed by recent tragedy, kicked in without question. "Margaret Sullivan," Morrison's voice boomed across the canyon, echoing off stone walls. "We know you're there. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody needs to get hurt." "He's lying," Ayana whispered. "Men like that, they always lie." Margaret knew she was right. She'd seen Morrison's kind of righteousness before, the type that justified any cruelty in the name of propriety. But she also knew they were outnumbered. outgunned. Nantan might take 2, maybe 3, before they brought him down. Then what would happen to Ayanna and Sheila? I'll talk to them, she decided. Buy time, maybe. No. Nantan's voice was flat. Final. No talking. They see Apache man with white woman. Talking ends. Only see what they want to see. Then what do we do? Before he could answer, Morrison called out again. Mrs. Sullivan, you've shamed yourself enough. That savage has no claim on you. The town council sent us to bring you back where you belong. Your husband's debts need settling, and there's those willing to pay them for a dutiful wife. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Debts Thomas had left debts, and under territorial law, she could be held responsible, could be essentially sold to cover them. She'd fled before learning the full extent of Thomas's failures. 10 minutes, Morrison continued. Then we come get you, and that Apache bastard dies slow for corrupting a Christian woman. Sheila made a small sound of fear. Margaret knelt before her quickly. Listen to me, brave girl. You go with Ayanna now. Hide until it's safe. Can you do that? The child nodded, clutching her wooden animals. But then she did something unexpected, pulled the small mirror Margaret had given her from her pouch and pressed it into Margaret's hands. Make light dance, she whispered. Confuse bad men. Margaret's eyes burned with sudden tears. This child, who'd lost everything, was trying to help save them. She kissed Sheila's forehead quickly. Good thinking, little warrior. Now go. Ayanna led Sheila toward the back of the canyon, moving silent as shadows. Margaret turned to find Nantan watching her with something fierce and desperate in his eyes. I won't let them take you, he said, and I won't watch you die for me. She gripped his hand hard. There has to be another way. 5 minutes now? Morrison's voice carried a note of anticipation that made her skin crawl. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Margaret looked at the mirror in her hands, then at the canyon walls where the last rays of sun still touched the upper reaches. An idea formed desperate, probably foolish, but better than waiting to be taken. Can you climb? She asked Nantan urgently. Up there, where the light still hits. He followed her gaze, understanding dawning. You make distraction. I get behind them. Both of us, we both climb. Let them enter an empty camp. She was already moving, gathering what they'd need. Ayanna knows these canyons better than us. She'll find another way out with Sheila. It was a wild plan, but Nantan nodded. They worked quickly, leaving evidence of hasty flight toward the back of the canyon's scattered belongings, clear tracks leading to where Ayanna and Sheila had actually hidden. Then, using skills Nantan had been teaching her, they began to climb. The rock was rough, offering decent handholds, but Margaret's skirts caught and tore. Heights had never been her friend, and her arms shook with effort. Below, she heard horses entering the canyon. Where are they? Morrison's voice, angry now. Fan out, check everywhere. Margaret reached a narrow ledge just as the last direct sunlight was fading. Perfect timing. She pulled out the mirror and began sending flashes of light down into the canyon, random, disorienting, seeming to come from multiple directions as she moved along the ledge. What the hell? Someone shouted. Up there, no, over there. Gunfire erupted, bullets chipping stone far from where she actually crouched. In the confusion, she saw Nantan moving like a ghost along the opposite wall, working his way behind their position. It's a trick, Morrison bellowed. Just light find the woman. But the dancing light and echoing gunshots had spooked the horses. They reared and plunged. Adding to the chaos, one man was thrown, cursing as he hit the ground hard. Margaret kept the light moving, her arms aching from the awkward position. Then she saw something that made her heart leap. Ayanna had emerged from hiding, but not fleeing. Instead, she was working her way toward the riders' horses, Sheila's small form just visible behind her. The clever woman had seen an opportunity in the chaos. A shot rang out closer to Margaret's position, rock fragments stinging her cheek. They'd figured out her general location. Time was running out. That's when Nantan struck. He dropped from above onto the rearmost rider, both men tumbling from the horse, even wounded, even outnumbered. He fought with the fierce efficiency of a warrior defending what was his. Another rider turned to help, only to find Ayanna had cut his saddle straps. He slid sideways, tangled in leather and cursing. "Get them!" Morrison screamed. But his men were in disarray. Horses scattered, 2 men down, shadows and light playing tricks on their eyes. Margaret half climbed, half fell from her perch. Knowing she needed to join the fight, she landed hard, ankle twisting, but forced herself forward. One of Morrison's men loomed before her, rifle raising. The mirror was still in her hand. Without thinking, she brought it up, catching the last ray of sunset directly into his eyes. He flinched, blinded, and she drove her shoulder into his stomach with all her weight. They went down together, rolling in the dirt. His hands found her throat, squeezing. Stars exploded across her vision. Then suddenly, the pressure was gone. The man yanked away by Nantan's fierce grip. "Behind you," Margaret gasped. Nantan spun as Morrison himself charged, the 2 men colliding with brutal force. They fought viciously, no quarter given or expected. Margaret scrambled for the dropped rifle, hands shaking as she tried to remember her father's lessons about firearms. "Don't move." She aimed at one of the remaining men who was advancing on Ayanna and Sheila. "I'll shoot." He laughed. "You won't. Good Christian women don't." The rifle bucked in her hands, the shot deafening in the enclosed canyon. The man yelped, clutching his shoulder where her bullet had grazed him. Not a killing shot, she wasn't ready for that, but enough to make her point. "The next one goes through your heart." She lied with as much conviction as she could muster. The tide had turned. 2 of Morrison's men were down and staying down. The one she'd shot was backing away, hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. Another had caught his spooked horse and was already fleeing. That left Morrison and 1 other, both still fighting but outnumbered now that their advantage was gone. "This isn't over," Morrison snarled, breaking free from Nantan's grip. Blood ran from his nose, and 1 eye was swelling shut. "You can't run forever, every town. Every settlement will know what you are, a white woman who chose savages over her own kind." "Then I choose well," Margaret said, keeping the rifle trained on him. "Because these savages show more humanity than you ever have." Morrison spat blood. "You're ruined, destroyed. No decent life will ever—" "Leave." Nantan's voice cut through his tirade like a blade. "Now, while you can still ride." For a moment, violence crackled in the air like lightning before a strike. Then Morrison gestured sharply to his remaining man. They gathered their wounded, mounted what horses they could catch, and rode out. Morrison turned back once at the canyon mouth. "This isn't over," he repeated. "The law—" "The law," Ayanna laughed, harsh and bitter. "What law protects Apache women from slavers? What law keeps soldiers from shooting children? Your law is nothing but words on paper. Here, we make our own justice." Morrison's face twisted with rage, but he had no answer. They watched until the riders disappeared into gathering darkness. Only then did Margaret lower the rifle, hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. Nantan caught her as her knees buckled, pulling her against him. "You did well," he murmured, like true warrior. "I was terrified." "All warriors are. Brave means acting despite fear." Sheila broke free from Ayanna's protective grip, running to throw her arms around Margaret's legs. "You made light dance," she exclaimed. "Confused bad men just like I said." Margaret laughed, slightly hysterical with relief. "Yes, little one, your plan worked perfectly." They spent a tense night in the canyon, taking turns on watch, but Morrison didn't return. At first light, they packed quickly and moved on, knowing they'd bought time but not safety. The encounter had changed things. Margaret was no longer just a runaway widow. She was a woman who'd chosen sides in a conflict older than her understanding. There would be no going back to the white world now, even if she'd wanted to. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sheila riding on Nantan's shoulders, Margaret felt the last ties to her old life snap like overstretched threads. Let Morrison spread his tales. Let the good people of Redemption Creek call her ruined. She'd found something worth being ruined for this makeshift family. This chance at a different kind of life, this freedom to choose who she would become. "The valley is close now," Nantan said, reading signs in the landscape she couldn't yet see. 2 days, maybe 3. And then, he smiled, reaching out to steady her on the rough trail. Then we learn what peace looks like, together. Behind them, Ayanna sang softly to Sheila in Apache, a traveling song about courage and new beginnings. Ahead, mountains rose like promises, hiding valleys where the world's rigid rules might bend enough to let love grow in unexpected forms. They walked toward that promise, leaving Morrison's threats to echo empty in the canyon behind them. Whatever came next, they would face it as they'd faced everything else together, unashamed and free. The night pressed close around their small camp, darker than usual with clouds obscuring the stars. They'd found shelter beneath an overhang of rock, the stones still warm from the day's sun. Sheila slept curled between Ayanna and Margaret, her small hands clutching the wooden animals even in dreams, but sleep eluded the adults, the afternoon's confrontation with Morrison's men leaving them all on edge. Margaret sat with her back against the rock wall, unable to shake the trembling that had seized her after the fight. She'd aimed a gun at another human being, had wounded him, seen his blood. The necessity of it didn't ease the sick feeling in her stomach. "You are troubled," Nantan said softly, settling beside her. Close enough that she felt his warmth, but maintaining the careful distance they'd observed since that night in the trading post when promises were exchanged. "I've never hurt anyone before," she admitted. "Never thought I could. To protect family is not same as to hurt from cruelty." His voice carried the weight of experience. "This difference matters. Does it get easier? No, should never be easy. When it becomes easy, we lose part of what makes us human." He shifted, favoring his still healing wound. "First time I fought to defend, I was younger than Sheila. Soldiers came to our winter camp. My mother pushed bow into my hands, told me to protect the little ones while warriors fought. I was so frightened I could barely draw string. What happened? I missed every shot, but standing there, trying, gave other children time to run." A pause. "Later, my father said courage was not in hitting target, but in standing when I wanted to flee." Margaret absorbed this, finding comfort in the shared humanity of fear. "I wanted to run today. When Morrison called out, every part of me wanted to disappear into the rocks like a rabbit. But you stayed, made plan, fought beside us." He turned to look at her directly. "This is who you are. Iskani, not the frightened woman they tried to make you, but this brave when needed, clever when cornered, fierce for those you claim as yours." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. In the weeks since they'd met, she'd grown used to reading his expressions, the subtle shifts that revealed thoughts his careful words might hide. Now she saw something raw there, quickly shuddered but unmistakable. "Nantan." "I know what was promised," he said quietly. "Partnership. Building something together. But I must speak truth." He looked away, jaw tight. "Each day I watch you with Sheila. See your kindness with Ayanna. Feel your strength beside me. And I think things I should not. Feel things that go beyond partnership." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd felt it too, this growing awareness, this pull that went deeper than mere alliance. But after Thomas, after years of marriage being a cage, "I'm frightened," she whispered. "Of me?" "No." The word came quick. "Certain. Never of you, frightened of myself, of wanting." She struggled for words. With Thomas, I learned to make myself small, to want nothing, need nothing, be nothing that might provoke. Now you show me I can be large, can take up space, can want things for myself. It's terrifying and wonderful, and I don't know how to navigate it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached for her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, calloused and gentle. "We navigate together," he said, slow, like crossing unknown river. "Test each step, no rushing, no forcing, only what feels right to both." She squeezed his hand, amazed at how such a simple touch could feel like revolution. "I want to be brave in this too, but I need time." "Yes, we have time," he smiled slightly. "Valley first, safety first. Let hearts settle before making new promises." A soft sound made them both turn. Ayanna sat up in her bedroll, eyes knowing in the darkness. "You two talk loud for people trying to whisper," she said dryly. "Wake the dead with your careful distances." "We woke you. I'm sorry," Margaret began, but Ayanna waved her off. "Sleep is for people without worries. I have many worries." She studied them both with frank assessment. "You know what others will say, white woman and Apache man. Living as married both worlds will call it wrong." "Let them," Margaret said, surprising herself with the fierceness of it. "What do either of our worlds offer us? His people are scattered or dead. Mine would see me sold to pay a dead man's debts. If wrong is the only place we can exist, then wrong will be." Ayanna smiled then, the expression transforming her usually serious face. "Good. Fire in you. You'll need it." She lay back down, then added, "But maybe save deep talks for daylight. Some of us trying to rest." Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling. Nantan squeezed her hand once more before releasing it, returning to his own bedroll. But the connection remained, invisible and undeniable as gravity. She dozed fitfully, waking near dawn to find Sheila sitting up, trembling from some nightmare. Without thought, Margaret gathered the child close, humming tunelessly until the shaking stopped. "Bad dream?" she asked softly. Sheila nodded against her chest. "Soldiers came, took everyone again." "Just a dream, little one. You're safe." Forever safe. Margaret's throat tightened. How could she promise forever in a world that broke such promises daily? "As long as I breathe, I'll fight to keep you safe. So will Nantan and Ayanna. That's the best promise I can give." Sheila considered this with the gravity of a child who'd learned early that promises were fragile things. "Good enough," she decided finally. "Will you tell story about Brave Horse?" So Margaret spun tales in the pre-dawn darkness, weaving words into shields against nightmares. Gradually, the others woke, joining the circle. Nantan added details about the horse's Apache friends. Ayanna provided voices for various animals. By the time the sun painted the eastern peaks gold, Sheila was giggling instead of trembling. They traveled steadily that day, climbing ever higher into mountains that seemed to scrape the sky itself. The trail narrowed until they had to lead the horses, picking their way carefully along paths where one false step meant a fatal fall. But Nantan moved with confidence now, reading signs left by those who'd passed before. "Close," he kept saying. "Very close now." Late afternoon brought them to what seemed an impasse, a sheer wall of stone blocking the canyon they'd been following. Margaret's heart sank. Had they come all this way for nothing? But Nantan was smiling. "Look closer," he said. She did, and gasped. What had seemed solid rock was an illusion created by overlapping stone faces. A narrow passage existed, barely wide enough for a horse, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "Natural protection," Ayanna murmured appreciatively. "No wonder the valley stays hidden." They entered single file, the passage so tight Margaret could touch both walls. It wound through the mountain like a snake, sometimes opening to reveal patches of sky, sometimes closing until they moved in near darkness. Sheila whimpered once at the pressing stone, But Nantan's steady voice ahead and Margaret's hand on her shoulder kept her moving. Then, suddenly, they emerged into light. The valley spread before them like a secret jewel, perhaps 3 miles long and half as wide, cradled by protective peaks. A stream wound through its heart, feeding meadows of grass that rippled gold in the slanted light. Smoke rose from several chimneys, actual buildings, not just wickiups or temporary shelters. Gardens grew in tidy rows, horses grazed in fenced pastures. But it was the people that made Margaret's breath catch. They emerged from homes and fields to watch the newcomers Apache and Mexican, white and Negro, even what might have been Chinese. Children of mixed heritage ran between the adults, curiosity overcoming caution. An elderly Apache woman stood beside a younger white man who was clearly her son. A Mexican vaquero worked alongside a Negro man repairing a fence. Easy partnership in their movements. "Welcome to Valle de la Paz," a voice called in accented English. A woman approached perhaps 40 years, with silver threading her black hair and intelligence shining in dark eyes. She wore a practical dress that borrowed from both Mexican and Apache styles. "I am Rosa Morales. I help coordinate things here." "Nantan," he said, stepping forward. "My cousin, Joseph Crowfeather, spoke of this place." "Joseph?" "Yes, he raises horses in the north pasture. He'll be glad to see family." Rosa's eyes moved over their small group, taking in the obvious bonds between them. "You seek sanctuary. We seek a place to build new life," Nantan replied, "away from those who say we cannot be." Rosa smiled, and it was like sun breaking through clouds. "Then you found it. We have one rule here: leave old hatreds at the entrance. Whatever you were before, whoever says you cannot be together, that stays outside. Here, you are only who you choose to be now." Sheila, who'd been hiding behind Margaret's skirts, peeked out. Rosa's expression softened further. "And who is this brave traveler?" "I'm Sheila," the child announced, finding courage. "Margaret tells me stories, and Nantan carved me a wolf, and Ayana teaches me string games." "Ah, a girl with 3 parents. You're lucky indeed." Rosa knelt to Sheila's level. "We have other children here for you to play with. Would you like that?" Sheila nodded eagerly, then looked up at Margaret with sudden worry. "But I stay with you." "Always," Margaret promised, throat tight with emotion. Rosa rose, gesturing broadly. "Come, I'll show you where you can shelter while you decide if this is truly home. Fair warning, life here isn't easy. We work hard, share resources, defend each other when needed. The outside world doesn't know exactly where we are, but they know we exist. Sometimes they send trouble." "We've met trouble," Ayana said dryly. "We're still standing." "Good. That spirit will serve you well." As they followed Rosa deeper into the valley, people called out greetings, some in English, some in Spanish or Apache or languages Margaret didn't recognize, but all carried the same note of welcome for fellow refugees from the world's harsh judgments. A man jogged up clearly Apache features mixed with something else, wearing gongzuo pants and a homespun shirt. "Cousin," he called to Nantan. "My eyes must be old, but you look like—" "Joseph," Nantan said, real warmth in his voice. "It's been too long." The men embraced, and Margaret saw some of Nantan's constant vigilance ease. Here was family, safety, a face from better times. "But Elu?" Joseph asked quietly. "And little Kuruk?" Nantan's face tightened. "Elu is gone. Kuruk, I still search, still hope." Joseph gripped his shoulder in wordless sympathy, then noticed Margaret. His eyebrows rose slightly, but his smile was genuine. "You travel with interesting companions. Cousin—" "My partner, Margaret," Nantan said simply, "and Ayana, and Sheila, who needs a home. Then home she'll have." Joseph said, "We have an empty cabin at the valley's east end. Needs work, but solid bones. You're welcome to it. As they walked through the settlement, Margaret felt something unknotting in her chest. This was real. This place. These people who'd made lives outside the narrow definitions of acceptable society. Here, she could be Margaret who chose Nantan without shame or explanation. Here, Sheila could grow up seeing all kinds of families, all kinds of love as normal. "It's really possible," she murmured, half to herself. Nantan heard her, reached over to brush her fingers with his. "New beginning," he agreed. "For all of us." The cabin proved to be small but sturdy, with a main room and 2 tiny bedchambers. Dust and neglect covered everything, but the roof was sound and the fireplace drew clean. Through the windows, mountains rose protectively on all sides. "Home," Sheila declared, already exploring every corner. Margaret met Nantan's eyes across the dusty space, saw her own hope reflected there. Not the ending of their journey, but the beginning of something richer. A place to heal, to grow, to discover what they could build when the world wasn't constantly trying to tear them apart. "Home," she agreed, and meant it. Winter had wrapped the valley in a blanket of pristine snow, transforming their hidden sanctuary into something from a fairy tale. 4 months had passed since they'd arrived at Valle de la Paz. 4 months of building not just a home, but a life. The cabin that had been dusty and abandoned now glowed with warmth. Curtains Margaret had sewn from traded fabric. Furniture Nantan had crafted with patient hands. Sheila's drawings decorating every available wall. Margaret stood at the frost-etched window, watching Sheila play with the other valley children, her laughter carrying clear as bell chimes through the cold air. The child who'd arrived hollow-eyed and silent now shrieked with joy as she pelted Joseph's son with snowballs. The transformation still took Margaret's breath away. "She hardly seems the same child," Ayanna said, joining her at the window. The young woman had taken the second small bedroom but spent most of her time at the valley's communal kitchen, where her gift for making much from little had quickly made her indispensable. "Children heal faster than adults," Margaret replied, "when given the chance." "Speaking of healing," Ayanna's tone turned sly, "when will you and Nantan stop dancing around each other like shy deer?" Heat crept up Margaret's neck. "I don't know what you mean." "Ha! The whole valley knows what I mean. Rosa has a betting pool on when you'll make it official." Margaret turned from the window, flustered. It was true that things between her and Nantan had deepened over the months. They worked side by side in the gardens, sat close during evening gatherings, shared looks that said more than words, but neither had pushed beyond the careful boundaries they'd established. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Love is simple," Ayanna countered. "People make it complicated." Before Margaret could respond, the door burst open in a flurry of snow and excited child. Sheila's cheeks glowed red with cold and happiness. "Margaret Nantan says come quick strangers at the pass." Margaret's stomach clenched. Strangers rarely meant good news. She grabbed her shawl and followed Sheila out into the winter afternoon. Other valley residents were already gathering near the entrance, that narrow passage through stone that protected their sanctuary. Nantan stood with Joseph and several others, watching 2 figures approach on foot through the snow. One appeared to be a Mexican woman, elderly and bent with years. The other, Margaret heard Nantan's sharp intake of breath. His whole body went rigid. Then he was running, plowing through knee-deep snow with desperate urgency. The smaller figure broke free from the elderly woman, running too, and even at a distance Margaret could hear the cry, "Papa, Papa!" They collided in an explosion of snow and tears. Nantan fell to his knees, crushing the boy against his chest, shoulders shaking with sobs he didn't try to hide. The child, it could only be Kuruk, clung to his father as if he might disappear, both of them speaking rapid Apache between tears. Margaret found herself crying too, joy and relief flooding through her. Beside her, Sheila watched with wide eyes. "His boy?" she asked softly. "His boy," Margaret confirmed. He's been searching so long. The elderly woman reached them, breathing hard from the journey. Rosa hurried forward to support her, guiding her toward the warmth of the nearest cabin. But not before the woman's eyes found Nantan's over Kuruk's head, speaking some message that made him bow deeply even while holding his son. It was an hour before the full story emerged. The elderly woman, Senora Valdez, had found Kuruk wandering alone and injured after the attack on his band. Her own grandson had been killed by soldiers the year before, and perhaps that shared grief made her take the Apache child in rather than turn him over to authorities. She'd hidden him, nursed him to health, claimed him as distant kin when anyone asked. "But I am old," she said, sitting by the communal fire with a cup of hot tea in gnarled hands. "My bones tell me my time comes soon. The boy needs his father." So we searched, following rumors. Whispers of a valley where Apache and white lived together, where a man named Nantan sought his lost son. "You risked much," Rosa said gently. "Harboring an Apache child, traveling so far in winter." Senora Valdez shrugged. "What is risk to one already so close to the next world? The boy deserved to grow up knowing who he is, where he comes from. This I could give." Kuruk hadn't left his father's side, pressed close as if to make up for months of separation. He was thin but healthy, with intelligent eyes that moved between all the adults, clearly trying to understand these new dynamics. When his gaze landed on Margaret, he frowned slightly. "You are the white woman who travels with my father." His English was careful but clear. Senora Valdez had been teaching him. "I am," Margaret said simply. He studied her for a long moment, then looked at Sheila, who was watching everything from behind Ayana's skirts. Something in his expression softened at the sight of another child. "Are you Apache too?" he asked Sheila. She nodded shyly. "But I live with Margaret now, and Nantan and Ayana. We're family." Kuruk's frown deepened. Working through this information, Margaret held her breath, understanding that this moment mattered deeply. The boy had lost his mother, been separated from his father, lived months in hiding. Now he was being asked to accept strangers as family. "My mother is gone," Kuruk said finally, the words carrying a weight no 7-year-old should bear. "Senora Valdez says she walks with spirits now." "Yes," Nantan said quietly, "but she watches over you still." Kuruk nodded, then looked again at Margaret. "Senora Valdez says sometimes new families grow from sadness, like flowers from ashes after fire." "She sounds very wise," Margaret said carefully. "She is." The boy moved slightly, not quite leaving his father's protection but inclining toward the broader circle. "I am hungry and tired." It was Sheila who broke the careful tension, stepping forward with the carved wolf Nantan had made her. "This is Wolf. He's brave and protects everyone. You can hold him if you want." Kuruk accepted the carved animal with the solemnity of a child who understood the magnitude of such an offer. "Thank you," he said formally, then added, "I had a carved horse, but I lost it when—" "I'll make you another," Nantan promised quickly. "As many as you want." The evening meal became a celebration. The entire valley, it seemed, wanted to welcome Kuruk and honor Senora Valdez for her courage. Food appeared from every household: stews and breads, preserved fruits, even a cake someone had been saving. Musicians brought out instruments, and soon the communal hall rang with songs in multiple languages. Margaret found herself in the kitchen, helping serve. When Senora Valdez approached, the elderly woman moved carefully, but with purpose. "You are the one who holds his heart," she said without preamble. Margaret flushed. It's complicated," Senora Valdez smiled. "Love often is, but I see how he looks at you, how you look at him, and I see how you looked at his son with a mother's worry, not a stranger's distance. I want Kuruk to feel safe here, to know he's wanted." "Then you are already mothering him." The old woman patted Margaret's hand with fingers soft as paper. "The boy has had enough loss. He needs to see that love can grow even after sorrow. Show him this. Show him that his father can smile again. Truly smile. This is the greatest gift you can give. As if summoned by her words, Nantan appeared in the doorway. His eyes found Margaret across the crowded room, and the look there made her heart skip. He'd always been handsome in his serious way, but joy transformed him. He looked younger, lighter, as if finding Kuruk had lifted years of weight from his shoulders. "Dance," he asked, extending his hand. The kitchen women made shooing motions, and Margaret found herself pulled into the main room where couples swirled to a Mexican waltz. She'd never danced with Nantan before. There'd always been too much uncertainty, too much careful distance. But tonight, with his son safe and their chosen family complete, the barriers seemed foolish. He held her properly, one hand at her waist, the other cradling hers. But there was nothing proper about the way awareness sparked between them, about how perfectly they fit together despite the differences in their heights. "Thank you," he said softly as they moved. "For what?" "For being here, for accepting Kuruk without question, for becoming the family I thought I'd lost forever." "Nantan?" Her throat tightened with emotion. "I know we said slow. I know we said careful. But Margaret," he stopped dancing, right there in the middle of the floor, heedless of others moving around them. "My heart has been yours for months now. I think it was yours from that first night you refused to leave me to die alone. I'm tired of pretending otherwise." Around them, Margaret was vaguely aware of the music continuing, of people politely not staring, but all she could see was Nantan's face, the vulnerability and hope there. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Tell me what frightens you." "That I'll lose myself again, that I'll become small to fit someone else's idea of what I should be." His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs gentle against her cheekbones. "Iskani, you could never be small. You fill every room you enter. You made that cabin a home, made Sheila bloom like a desert flower after rain. You stood against armed men to protect us. You are vast as the sky, and I would never ask you to be less." "I love you," she said, the words escaping like birds taking flight. "I've loved you for so long, but I was too frightened to—" He kissed her then, there in the middle of the dance floor with the whole valley watching. It wasn't their first kiss. There'd been a few stolen moments in recent weeks, but it was their first public declaration. When they broke apart, cheers erupted around them. "Finally," Ayana called out. "Rosa, who had today in the betting pool?" Even Kuruk was smiling from where he sat with Sheila, the two children already thick as thieves. Senora Valdez nodded approvingly from her chair by the fire. Later, much later, after the celebration had wound down and children had been tucked into bed, Margaret stood once more at her cabin window, but this time, Nantan's arms were wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her head. "How does Kuruk seem to you?" he asked quietly. "Cautious but not closed. He'll need time, but I think he'll adjust well. Sheila has already adopted him as a brother." "And you?" His arms tightened slightly. "Could you adopt him as a son?" Margaret turned in his arms to face him. "He's already mine," she said firmly. "Yours, mine, ours. That's how family works." Through the walls, they could hear the soft sounds of the children sleeping Sheila in her small bed. Kuruk on a pallet Nantan had quickly assembled. Ayana had tactfully decided to spend the night with friends, giving them space to navigate this new reality. "Marry me," Nantan said suddenly, not in the white way with papers and priests, but in the way that matters. "Stand with me before the valley. Declare ourselves bound. Make it real in all eyes, not just ours." "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "Yes, to all of it. To you, to the children, to this life we're building." He kissed her again, deeper this time, full of promise and passion carefully banked. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought to have this again," he confessed. family, love, hope for tomorrow. You gave all of it back. We gave it to each other, she corrected. That's what partners do. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing their valley in pristine white. But inside the cabin, warmth reigned not just from the fire, but from the living connections between souls who'd found each other against all odds. In the morning, Karuk would wake to his first full day in a new home. Sheila would introduce him to every corner of the valley. Ayana would cook breakfast while gently teasing everyone. And Margaret and Nantan would begin planning a ceremony to formalize what their hearts had long since decided. But tonight, in this perfect moment, Margaret stood in the arms of the man she'd chosen, listening to the breathing of children they'd protect with their lives, feeling the solid reality of the home they'd built from nothing but determination and trust. "Get your things," Nantan whispered against her ear, echoing words he'd spoken before but with new meaning now. "You're mine. I'm yours. We're family. Forever," she whispered back, and meant it. Outside their hidden valley, the world continued with its rigid rules and narrow definitions of acceptable love. Men like Morrison would always exist, ready to punish those who dared step outside prescribed boundaries. But here, in this sanctuary, carved from wilderness and will, two broken people had built something whole. They'd gathered other lost souls along the way, Ayana seeking purpose, Sheila needing parents, Karuk requiring a safe harbor, and made something stronger than any of them could have been alone. It was not the life Margaret had imagined as a young bride in Redemption Creek. It was infinitely better chosen freely, built carefully, defended fiercely. A life where she could be both soft and strong, where love came without ownership, where families formed from choice rather than mere blood. As the snow continued to fall, Margaret closed her eyes and sent up a prayer of gratitude to whatever spirits had guided their paths to cross. In losing everything, she'd found all that truly mattered. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The outside world wouldn't stop trying to intrude. There would be hard work and harder choices. But tonight, surrounded by love in all its forms, Margaret Sullivan, who would tomorrow become simply Margaret, partner to Nantan, mother to two remarkable children, member of a community that defied definition, knew she was exactly where she belonged. The journey that began with desperate flight had led to this: a home, a family, a future bright with possibility. And it was only the beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and exchange thoughts about this tale. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help more people discover this story. Your support means everything.